All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We have a wonderful webinar for you today on cut flower gardening. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Andrew Daphne. I'm the Instruction and Outreach Librarian at the New Jersey State Library. And our speaker today is Margaret Pickoff from the uh, county. She's the county horticulturist for the Rugters Cooperative Extension of Mercer County, where she delivers educational programming on home horticulture and coordinates the Rutgers Master Gardener and Rutgers Environmental Stewards programs. She holds a Master of Science degree in Plant, Soil, and Environmental Sciences from the University of Maine, specializing in organic crop production and soil fertility. She developed her interest in plants and land stewardship while working on small farms in the community gardens in New Jersey, Maine, and Washington State. And she loves growing vegetables, flowers, and herbs in her community garden plot. So first, we'll go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the question box on the GoToWebinar dashboard, or you can email me directly at adaphne@njstatelib.org. There will be a survey that will pop up at the end of this program, as well as in a follow-up email. So if you could please complete that, I would greatly appreciate your feedback. And if you're looking for more gardening information, you can visit the Master Gardeners of Mercer County at mgofmc.org, and they have a whole host of resources and information on all types of gardening there. So I really encourage you to look at that for more information. And before we start, just for those of you who might not be familiar with GoToWebinar and the interface, this is what the dashboard should look like, and it should appear on the right-hand side of your screen. If it's not there, it may have been collapsed, so all you have to do is click on this orange arrow here, and that will expand the dashboard for you. There are no handouts here, but I would like to point you to the questions box. Here you can enter any questions you have, and Margaret will answer them at the end of the program. If you are having trouble utilizing any of the features or you're running into any issues, you can also hit this raise hand button here, and I will get in contact with you to see if I can help you in any way. So without further ado, I will give it over to Margaret.
Thanks so much, Andrew. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Let's see. And so you should be seeing my title slide here. Are we all set there?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, thank you so much. Again, I'm Margaret Pickoff, and I'm county horticulturist for Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Mercer County, where I have the pleasure of coordinating the Rutgers Master Gardener program for our county, as well as the Rutgers Environmental Steward program. I also answer home horticulture questions from the public, I believe the state library, we've had an ongoing relationship with you guys for a while through our Master Gardener program, and Master Gardeners have given presentations in the past. And so I was delighted to be asked to speak this year. Of course, we were planning on a small gathering at the library in person, and instead here we are on a webinar, but from what I understand, we've had this really wonderful response, and there's lots of people tuning in, so that is great. So I'm so glad that you're here. And I just wanted to point out that I just pulled this up from our Rutgers Cooperative Extension of Mercer County website. Our office is closed, as are most county and state offices at this point, but you can still contact us. We're all still working from home, and if you go to our website, we do have some resources on the website, and then we have a point person for each department who is there to help with different needs that you might have during this time, and also a link to the Rutgers COVID-19 page. So feel free to check that out as well. Okay, so our topic today is planting and maintaining a cut flower garden. And so I thought I would start with this photo of a traditional flower garden. So this is a photo that I took at Fort Ticonderoga, which is in upstate New York, a few summers ago. So when I think of a traditional flower garden, this is kind of what I think of. So we've got, it's very design focused. The choice of plants probably has a lot to do with color, with texture. These plants were placed in very specific areas based on sort of an aesthetic vision that the gardener had. So we've got some short little pops of color in the front along a pathway where we have some marigolds. And then some zinnias, you know, leading up to these taller plants. So lots of design focused here, square beds, everything looks very neat. So when we compare that with a cut flower garden, it's a pretty different look. I happen to think this also looks quite beautiful, but it's not what you would maybe have in mind for a traditional flower garden.
Hi,
And
Margaret.
that's what,
Just to let you know, the slides are not advancing.
oh, that shouldn't be happening. Let's see, they're advancing on my screen.
There you go.
Um,
That changed.
how about now? Are you,
Um,
let's see. So I'm trying to start the slideshow and it doesn't appear to be starting on your screen, but it is on mine.
no, yeah, our screen it freezes on whatever slide you're on when you click the Start Show button.
Okay, so if I advance, you have not seen that slide advance.
No.
Okay. Um, how about now? So if I advance the slide
Yes.
now,
Yep. Yep.
okay.
That looks great.
Okay, well, we've surpassed our first technical hurdle. Okay, so again, yeah, this is maybe what a cut flower garden would look like in relation. I don't know if you even saw this slide, but that's your traditional flower garden. So again, we have some differences based on the fact that a cut flower garden, its purpose is for production. And so I think a lot of people start cut flower gardens because they feel a little bit guilty taking cuttings of their nice ornamental beds. And so they want to designate a specific part of the garden to production so that they can cut stems for bouquets and arrangements to bring indoors. So slightly different type of flower garden. And of course, you know, we all aspire to make these very beautiful floral arrangements. There is no shortage of inspiration to be found online, especially nowadays. There's been a lot of interest in commercial production of cut flowers, especially local and organic cut flower productions, who have been kind of become famous for making these very beautiful pieces for weddings and other events. But of course, you don't have to get this fancy. These are some nice examples, but you know, a couple of stems of daffodils or tulips in a very simple vase can also be a really wonderful contribution to a dinner table, for example. Oops. All right. So again, cut flower gardens are production focused. And so they might appear a little bit more like your traditional vegetable beds. So they're planted usually in rows. And we plant kind of like species with one another. And we provide walking paths. And this is usually so that it's easy to harvest, to maintain these plants the same as you would in your vegetable garden. The plants that we choose are based on what our desired arrangements will be. And so some people have a very specific idea of the types of bouquets they'd like to create, maybe the types of the different colors that they're drawn to, and they might pick flowers based on that. There's different styles. Maybe you want to include some things in your bouquet that give off a nice scent. In general, you're looking for flowers that produce long, sturdy stems and that produce a lot of flowers in the length of a growing season. And so that's a good place to start. So flowering plants in the landscape. So before you even designate a place in your garden for cut flowers, you might want to look around your home landscape or the landscape around you and see where are there flowers already growing. So we have these different categories of flowering plants that it's helpful to get to know before we kind of start designing our cut flower garden. So the most basic one that probably beginners will start with in a cut flower garden are and these include both tender and hardy annuals. So these are your plants that will flower, set seed, and die in one growing season. So cosmos, zinnia, those are both examples of annuals. These are the easiest to start with because they tend to produce a lot of flowers, and it's not quite as much of an upfront cost. The seed is usually quite inexpensive, so this is a great place to start for a cutting garden. Usually annuals will bloom over a long period of time, and they're often very colorful and showy. And if you think about the sort of life cycle of these flowers, it makes sense that they would have a longer bloom time. Because they're only going to be alive for 1 year, they want to make the most of that year. So they're putting out lots of blossoms. They're hoping to be pollinated by different pollinators and set seed so that they can succeed into the next year. Biennials are plants that will produce vegetative growth in the first year and then flower and set seed in the second year. And so some examples would include Canterbury bells, foxglove. So some of our favorite garden plants. In some regions, biennial plants are grown as annuals. Sometimes it depends on the variety that you're looking for. So we'll go over how to choose specific varieties for cutting towards the end of the presentation. But it's good to know if a plant is a biennial or a perennial because that has sort of incorporated specific genetic information into those seeds. So the seeds won't necessarily germinate if you plant them in your garden the first year. So they might require a period of cold. And so in order to get the seeds to germinate, you might have to do something called cold stratification. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. It's always important to read the seed packet, which is something I'll mention multiple times in this presentation. And then we have our perennials. So some of you might already have perennial flowering plants in your garden. These are plants that have roots that continue to live year after year, but the stems will die back in the winter time. And so these plants tend to persist between 2 and any number of years, depending on the plant. They're less labor intensive once they're established. And so many gardeners really love perennials because they will come back every year as long as they are able to survive. They can reproduce by seed, divisions, or cuttings. One drawback, especially for the cut flower garden for perennials, is that they have a much shorter bloom period. So whereas annuals will produce blossoms maybe throughout your entire summer, usually the bloom period for perennials is more like 1 to 2 weeks. So during that 1 to 2 week period, they might be very glorious and beautiful, but it's a much shorter bloom period. So you'd have to plan a little bit more carefully for those. So cardinal flower, columbine are examples of perennials that grow well in our region. I wanted to mention flowering vines. I'm not going to talk too much about them, but they are another flowering plant that you might already have in your landscape. They're vigorous growers typically. They don't require a lot of maintenance. Sometimes they will need some winter pruning. It, again, just depends on what species you have. But I wanted to include a slide on flowering vines because they often have these really interesting tendrils or leaves or really interesting foliage. Maybe it kind of drapes or has some other interesting characteristic that might make it nice for an arrangement. And so you might overlook these in your landscape for a cut flower, a bouquet, or some sort of arrangement. because again, I had said look for long, sturdy stems, which obviously vines do not have, but they can add something nice to an arrangement as well. And then flowering trees and shrubs. And so this is a wonderful time of year to be noticing what flowering trees and shrubs you have around your property. Maybe your neighbors have some. Many of them are flowering right now or have been in the last couple of weeks. And so things like hydrangea, crabapple trees, viburnum, they're all sort of in this beautiful period of blooming at this point in the spring. So again, you know, these are plants that they will take multiple years to mature, and so the upfront investment is quite large. And I wouldn't suggest planting shrubs and trees specifically for floral arrangements, but again, they are parts of your landscape that you might be able to incorporate into arrangements down the road. And so you can use flowers, the foliage, these nice woody stems, which are really sturdy, and many of them will fruit, so you can use those as kind of a nice addition to arrangements as well. And then spring flowering bulbs, which we've also been enjoying in the last couple of weeks. And so these are plants that have their food structure, storage structure underground. So we think of daffodils, tulips, crocus, and allium. Okay, so now that we've kind of looked at a couple of different types of flowering plants in the landscape, I'd like to talk about how to prepare a garden site and how to start seeds, because we're at a point in the season where seed starting, we're kind of in prime seed starting territory at this point in the spring, maybe even a little bit late to be starting seeds, but we'll go over what that looks like as well. So for planting and soil conditions, especially if you're starting with annual flowers, most annual flowering plants need full sun. And we will talk about what that means and how to know if you have full sun on your property. In addition, if you have a choice of where to put your cut flower garden, trying to put it in a place that doesn't have a lot of wind on your property is a good idea. That's not just because, as you can see in the photo to the left, those tall zinnias, many of these flowering plants will get bushy and tall. And if you're in a very windy area, not only could they potentially flop over or become damaged, but wind will actually wick moisture away from the soil surface and the foliage of the plants. And so you're going to find that you have to water more frequently. In addition, you know, again, this is assuming you have some choice in the matter of where you place your flower garden, but if you can place it in a part of your property that has low perennial weed pressure, that is a great way to cut down on the amount of weeding and frustration that you'll have in years to come. We want to start with a fertile, well-drained soil. And most of the plants that you would have in a cutting garden do well with a soil pH between 6.2 and 6.5. So I'm going to break those things down and go through them step by step. So the first thing you'd want to do is to assess light conditions on your property. And you know, you hear the terms full sun, partial shade thrown around when it comes to choosing the right place for a garden and the right place to put a plant on your property. And maybe you're not quite sure what those terms mean or how to know, you know, what kind of sunlight your property gets. And so this is a sort of general term. Full sun usually means at least 6 hours of direct sunlight per day. Some people would say more like 8 hours. And so this is a particularly sunny part of your property, away from any large structures or trees. Partial sun would be more like 4 to 6 hours, and then partial shade is 2 to 4 hours. And so you'd want to find the sunniest part of your property If you're not quite sure, if you've just moved into a new house or you just have never noticed before, what I would recommend at this point in the season and a little bit as we get into summer is just to notice, we're all sort of home a lot more often than we usually are at this point. And so what I would recommend is just making a point to keep a journal and notice where the sun is at various points in the day a couple of times a year. And that is a good way to figure out where the sunniest parts of your property are. And so the picture on the right, in the shade of a large tree, you wouldn't want to have flowering plants, especially flowering annuals, because they just won't do well. I would place more foliage plants there, so maybe some hosta, your sort of more foliage-based perennial plants can go in the more shady parts of your property. But for your cutting garden, try to find the sunniest places you can. Another great place to start before you even start planting anything is to get a soil test. So remember I had mentioned that most of these flowering plants that you would include in a cutting garden, they do the best when they've got a pH between 6.2 and 6.5. This is kind of the same range that we strive for a lot of vegetable crops as well. And so the way that you figure that out is by getting a soil test. And actually, as of this morning, I believe, the Rutgers Soil Testing Lab has opened back up. So they are currently taking soil samples and can do the testing on them, whereas in the past couple of weeks, they haven't had the capacity to do that because things have been closed. So you can go to the link that's on the bottom of this slide, or you can Google Rutgers Soil Testing Lab. You send them a sample of your soil. You can print out the forms on the website. So you're not able to actually get a physical soil testing kit right now since our offices are closed, but you can print out the forms on the website and send them in with your soil sample. And in a couple of weeks, you'll get back something that looks like the soil test results on the right. And if that looks a little bit scary to interpret, or there's using some terms you don't understand, that's a great reason to reach out to our master gardeners. You can email me and we can help you to interpret what that means. But one thing I would just want to point out is right at the top, it gives you the pH value. So that's 6.63. That's a great pH for starting a flower garden. This will also tell you if you're deficient in any major nutrients and might have to add a specific fertilizer. And so you want to place your flower garden in a part of your property that has pretty good drainage. If you notice that there are parts of your lawn or your property where water tends to puddle after a big rainstorm, that's probably not the best place to put your flower garden, especially if you're using perennial plants, because standing water can create root rot and the sorts of conditions that favor lots of fungal diseases. And so you'll notice in a kind of a theme here as we go forward is in order to have the most productive garden, and that this applies to cutting gardens, to perennial gardens, to vegetable gardens, you want to take away as many external sort of difficulties on your plants as possible, because they're going to be more resilient the happier they are, which makes sense. So if you're placing your garden in a place that already has poor drainage, you're not starting off on a very good foot, and you're kind of opening the door to more pest and disease issues down the road. So you can either choose a different place to put your garden that is not puddling up after a rainstorm. You might choose to plant your garden in a raised bed, which would improve the drainage quite a bit. Or you can do some things to amend the soil. You can add compost. Sometimes you can add some coarse sand. If you have very clayey soil, that might not work quite as well. But we can also, based on your individual conditions at home, we can sort of help you address that issue. But this is definitely another thing that you would want to take note of before you actually start planting in your garden. So what soil conditions are we actually looking for? So typically, again, we want a fertile, well-drained soil, and that looks like the top photo here. So it's a soil that has these aggregates or soil particles that bind together, and that will allow the soil to hang on to water and nutrients a little bit more easily. Just a word of wisdom at this point in the year, because it's spring and we tend to get a lot of rain, you want to resist the urge to work the soil too often. And so I think that something that a lot of beginning gardeners do, myself, and I'm totally included in that in the past, is you get out there in the early spring and you just want to till that soil and make it nice and fluffy and bring in a lot of heat and warmth and airflow to it because it's been winter and it might look kind of compact. But try not to work it too much or too often when it's super rainy outside like it is at this point in the year. Because what will happen is you'll get that kind of crusty soil on the top that's going to make it much harder to work with later in the season. And again, you can start seeds indoors or you can direct sow outside. So we're kind of at a point in the year when it's warm enough now that you can probably start direct sowing outside. But if this were a couple of weeks ago or maybe sometime in March, I would probably recommend that you start your seeds indoors if you have the capability to do that. And this allows you to kind of get a jump start on the growing season. So you can start these so that they are strong, healthy seedlings by the time that you put them outside. And you can do that by sowing into soilless potting mix. Usually folks use seedling trays like the one shown on the top left, and some sort of light setup. You want to time the seeding with your region's frost-free date or whatever planting date you have in mind. And to do this, again, it depends on which flower you're working with, but you want to cover most seeds very lightly with soil. Keep them warm and moist, and some people will use a plastic covering to sort of speed up the germination and growth of these seedlings. I included this because it's a great resource. This is Margaret Roach's A Way to Garden blog. Her spring garden calculator is such a handy tool. If you're not sure when to start seeds in the spring, she has created this calculator that allows you to put your frost-free date into the top right, and it will automatically calculate exactly when you should be starting your seeds indoors. And so for us, I've put today's date, May 5th, because this happens to be just about the frost-free date for Mercer County. And so again, you can go through the process of looking at all your seed packets, determining how many weeks ahead of time you should be planting or sowing indoors. But I found this to be a very helpful tool. So you can use the link at the bottom here, or again, just Google A Way to Garden, Spring Garden Calculator. If you're working with transplants, so these can either be purchased at a farmer's market, a nursery, a plant store, or maybe the transplants that you grew indoors. They're usually ready to go outside once they've got two sets or two true leaves. So those are the leaves. If you're looking at I believe that's Cosmos to the upper right, you see the first kind of smooth leaves that come out. Those are called the cotyledons. But the first sort of feathery looking ones, those are actually the true leaves. Those are the actual, that's a little bit more like what the plant leaves are going to look like when it's mature. And so once you've got two sets of those true leaves, the plant is usually sturdy enough and has developed enough of a root biomass to be transplanted outdoors. If you're going to be taking your transplants from inside and moving them outdoors to plant, you want to make sure that you do something called hardening off, which is gradually introducing your seedlings to outdoor temperatures and outdoor conditions. So rather than going from their nice cozy home inside under your grow lights where it's warm, right outside where it's windy and cold, you want to gradually introduce the seedlings to those outdoor elements. So you can do that over a period of 2 weeks. It's best to, if you can, to plant your transplants on an overcast day. Make sure that you water within an hour of planting, and then be mindful of the spacing. And so the spacing, again, is going to depend on what exactly the flower is that you're working with. That information will also be on your seed packet. So again, you can purchase flats of these transplants at a garden center or a nursery, and you would follow the same process. At this time of year, since the soil is warming up and we're sort of out of the window of danger of that spring frost, you might consider direct sowing. So again, I know I'm saying this a lot, but do read your seed packet because there's a lot of good information on the back there. This will tell you when you can sow outside, how deep the seeds should be sown, the spacing, and usually it will tell you how many days to emergence, so when you can start to expect to see those seedlings popping up through the soil. Make sure that you check for special germination instructions, and I'll talk about that more in the next slide. And check the date on old seed packets. In general, for most annual flowers especially, those seeds are going to be viable for a couple of years. You might start to see the quality and the viability go down after a couple of years, but you don't by any means really have to purchase seeds every single year. So feel free to use those seed packets from previous years. You might not have as good of germination, but it's no reason to throw them away. So again, I had mentioned special germination instructions, and one of those is again called stratification, which we mentioned earlier when talking about biennial and perennial plants. So these plants have developed a really cool mechanism to make sure that their seeds don't germinate until the springtime. So basically what they do is the seed has to go through a period of cold in order to break its dormancy. That's the plant's way of knowing, okay, we've been through a winter and now it's spring, so it's a good time to germinate. So for example, black-eyed Susan and columbine, you'll usually see on the back of these seed packets that you have to cold stratify these seeds before you plant them in order for them to germinate. And I have tried, you can try to plant them right out in the garden in the spring. I have tried to do that because I've been, I have not wanted to wait the 4 weeks or so that you have to cold stratify, but believe me, they are not going to germinate very well. So to stratify them, you would put your seeds in a plastic bag with a moist paper towel, maybe some sphagnum moss or sand, and put them in the refrigerator for 4 weeks. And that's usually enough to sort of trick those seeds into thinking that they've gone through a winter season so that their dormancy will break when you plant them. Another way to do this is to plant these seeds in the fall so that they actually do go through a winter season outside. But when you do that, you risk the natural elements. You might have some seed decay throughout the winter, and you might have some seed predation from birds and insects and other animals. All right, so we'll shift into maintenance and care of these flowers now that you have an idea of what your garden site might look like and some of the things you have to do before you start planting. So once you have your plants in the ground, you want to set up a good watering schedule. Typically 1 inch per week is good for most flowering plants. And this goes for most plants in the garden. They prefer a deep, infrequent watering to a frequent, shallow watering. This is one good way to make sure that your plants are developing a nice, strong root system. Try watering in the morning or the early afternoon. We typically don't recommend that people water in the evening, even though it's nice and cool out in the summertime. Having that kind of the temperature drop in the night plus the wet soil and maybe wet foliage, that's the perfect condition for fungal diseases to develop. So keep your watering to morning or early afternoon if you can. And you might think about investing in some soaker hoses. So the soaker hose looks like on the bottom photo there. This will kind of deliver water in little drips right at the base of your plants over a longer period of time, rather than overhead watering. So again, most plants don't actually like getting their leaves wet. They want water just at the base of the plant, at their root zone. And again, watering, overwatering, watering from the top of the plant and getting the foliage wet day after day can actually increase your instance of fungal diseases and other pathogens. So hopefully you followed our advice and you chose a nice spot that had low perennial weed pressure for your garden. But weeding is going to be a part of maintaining your cut flower garden. A lot of cut flower plants are quite delicate, and especially the ones that maybe don't have quite as sturdy stems, they might be impacted by weed growth. Those weeds are also taking up water and nutrients that would otherwise go to your plants. So because they're such delicate plants, even in commercial settings, most of the weeding is done by hand. This could be great exercise. It's a nice way to get outside. I would develop a good relationship with weeding if you want to be any sort of gardener. So you can use your hands. There's also a couple of different hand tools that I would recommend. You have your dandelion digger on the middle photo on the top there, which is great for removing weeds that have a long taproot. I also really like the hori hori knife, which is at the bottom. Kind of looks like a machete. It's a great tool for the garden, again, for plants that weeds that have a really developed root system. And then a stirrup hoe is a nice option for kind of shallow rooted weeds, especially for folks who don't necessarily want to get down on their knees. It can be an easier option for standing while weeding. You can also reduce your weed pressure by installing some physical barriers and mulches. So many gardeners enjoy using some organic materials as mulch, like leaves, brown paper mulch, grass clippings. This is a nice way to add organic matter to your soil as well. This will keep weeds down and will decrease the amount of soil evaporation happening at the soil surface. So hopefully you won't have to water quite as much. There's also synthetic mulches, and I've mostly seen these used on more commercial operations, but many small farmers will use black plastic as a mulch and then create little holes where their seedlings can go in. That allows the soil to warm up a little bit faster and is also a really nice weed barrier as well. One part of maintenance of flowering annuals, especially, that it was really difficult for me to get on board with here was pinching back. And so this is basically removing the upper plant tissue when your plants have 4 sets of leaves. For flowering annuals like zinnias and for some tubers like dahlias, these plants that produce lots of branches and have sort of an upward habit, a kind of a vertical habit, by pinching back the top vegetation, you're actually encouraging the plant to get bushier and to create more flowering stems. And so, and by that, you're encouraging greater floral production throughout the length of the season. I will say that this feels terrible to do the first couple of times because you've just spent all of this effort growing these little seedlings. They still look very delicate, and here you are coming in with your scissors or your clippers and pinching back the top vegetation. But it does work. It increases the amount of flowering stems that you have. So it's a good practice to do in the start of the season that will kind of yield results as the growing season continues. Deadheading, you're probably familiar, and so this is cutting off spent flowers in order to encourage the plant to flower some more. And again, this all has to do with the signals that the flower is getting from its environment. So once a flower blooms, assuming that it's been pollinated, an annual flower will start to go to seed, like zinnias. Once they start going to seed, they've kind of gotten this signal that, okay, I've produced seeds, it's time to die, I've fulfilled my purpose here, so I'm not going to flower anymore because you know, we've crossed the finish line here, we've produced seeds. So the purpose of deadheading from a floral production standpoint is to stop the flower from producing seeds so that it continues to produce flowers for a longer period of time. There's also the aesthetic part of it, which is that these spent floral heads don't really look that nice. And so people do this practice for other flowering plants as well, to kind of make sure that their gardens are looking nice. But it does have benefits for your floral production as well. And to do this, you would cut right below the spent flower above the next set of healthy leaves, and just make sure that you're not cutting off any flower buds in the process. So you might have to be a little bit careful at first, but you do get the hang of it as you go. And then ongoing care, you know, as with all gardening, especially with annuals, you will continually have to thin out the plants so that they have enough room to continue growing. Weeding, again, is an ongoing task for any sort of garden. Trellising and staking of plants that are really tall and might flop over. Fertilizing is going to depend both on the type of flower that you're growing and the results of your soil test kit. So for flowers that produce a lot, like those zinnias, you might have to fertilize a little bit more because the plant is putting more resources into flowering over a longer period of time. And so many flower gardeners will use an organic fertilizer that has a lot of nitrogen in it. I know some folks will use fish emulsion, some people will use a seaweed solution to kind of continue to feed the flower as it's continuing to produce throughout the season. And then this was just a photo of a field of dahlias and an example of what a staking mechanism might look like. So dahlias will grow very tall, and again, they've got those long floral stems, which makes them great for bouquets and other arrangements, but it also makes them prone to flopping over. So providing some support, especially for the taller plants, is a nice way to ensure that they're not going to incur any damage. This also makes it easier to harvest as well. Deer damage is trying to contend with the deer population in New Jersey is an ongoing challenge for any gardener. Deer really love young succulent shoots of plants, and so your little seedlings that you're growing and putting outside, many flowering plants are quite attractive to deer. And you'll notice deer damage in your property if you haven't already. It will look like the edge of the vegetation will have been torn. I think deer lack the front incisors that other animals have, so they actually don't bite, they kind of tear off the vegetation. So it'll look like a jagged edge to your leaves or your stems. And so, you know, there are a couple of different mechanisms here for preventing deer damage. One is to avoid using the species that they prefer. So they love tulips. They really like daylilies. So if you can, you know, prevent them from munching on those by not planting them, you might instead plant species that deer do not find as palatable. So things that are fuzzy or spiky or have a scent to them. Lots of flowering herbs like lavender or something fuzzy like a sunflower. You can also apply, there are commercially available repellents that sort of deter deer based on taste and odor, so those can be effective. Probably the most effective way of preventing deer damage is to use exclusion fencing, so a really tall fence, or at least one that is taller than your neighbor's garden fence, so that they choose to go over there instead of your property. But that tends to be a more expensive management technique. And I did include the title of a really great fact sheet here, Landscape Plants Rated by Deer Resistance, from Rutgers Cooperative Extension, which is another great resource. Managing diseases and pests, I'm not going to stay here for too long, but the same sort of principles apply as for other types of gardening. That is to purchase the highest quality, most disease-free plants you can find. So obviously, you want to inspect any transplants or seedlings that you're purchasing at nurseries and garden centers for any pre-existing disease or pest issues. There are also lots of different varieties for cut flowers, and so there are ones that are particularly disease and pest resistant, and so I would recommend planting those. And then if you do see a disease problem, especially one that has caused the fast decline of one of your plants, I would remove that plant as soon as you can from the garden if it's determined to be a disease issue. And again, don't place those in the compost pile. I would destroy those or put them in the garbage. This is a great resource for pest management on the home grounds that's available on the extension website. I've put the link here, but you can, again, you can just Google pest management for trees, shrubs, and flowers on the home grounds. That's what I, the horticulturist, and our master gardeners will use to give advice for different pest issues to home gardeners for all sorts of gardening problems. All right, I'm just going to spend a few more minutes because I do want to be able to answer a couple of questions. So I'm going to fly through these last couple of slides here. Choosing plants, so it's a lot of information I'm throwing at you, but the best place to start for a cut flower garden are the high producing annual flowers. So zinnias are a go-to for a lot of beginning cut flower gardeners. Cosmos, they're big pops of color. They will grow in a variety of conditions. They're bright and they fit very well into lots of different arrangements and bouquets. Rudbeckia, or black-eyed Susan, is technically a tender perennial, but mostly it's grown as an annual in cut flower gardens. And Gomphrena is just a really kind of whimsical, cute-looking flowering annual that I really like. The medium producers would be things like snapdragon, Love Lies Bleeding, which not a lot, not everybody loves that look of those amaranth seeds sort of draping down, but I happen to really like them. And sunflowers, especially multi-branching sunflowers, which will produce flowers throughout the season. Don't forget to add foliage plants and ornamental grasses. You might have some ornamental grasses already on your property, and these look really beautiful in arrangements. I also really like bells of Ireland and eucalyptus because they're beautiful colors and they add a nice texture. And then the filler flowers. So maybe your zinnias and your cosmos and your rudbeckia are more kind of your central pieces to your arrangement, but you need something to kind of fill these arrangements out a little bit more. So remembering to plant things that have smaller, maybe less showy flowers can be really nice. So I really like Status, Yarrow, Celosia, also add really nice textures to an arrangement or a bouquet. Some other considerations, you can try succession planting. So that means planting at different times in your garden. So say you plant out your zinnias as soon as the soil warms up in the spring. You might plant them again in the early summer, maybe in the late summer. And so you have lots of production throughout the season, and they don't kind of start to thin out towards the end of your summer season. Sounds obvious, but planting taller flowers in a place where they won't shade out shorter ones, that is a good consideration to make before you plant. And then experiment with spacing. And so for certain species of these cutting flowers, they're going to create longer, sturdier stems depending on the spacing. And so the first thing you want to do is to space them according to the seed packet instructions. That's a good place to start. But the next season, you might try planting a little bit closer and see what effect that has on your production. Often that will end up producing longer floral stems. You might get fewer flowers or smaller flowers, but that's an interesting way to experiment with the garden from year to year. And then flower harvest. So obviously you want to harvest using sharp, clean tools. Keep those clippers nice and clean. The timing of harvest will depend on the type of flower. So lots of those disc flowers, the ones that kind of look like daisies, like zinnia and your rudbeckia, your sunflowers, those can usually be harvested once they're fully opened. But things like spike flowers, like the snapdragons, maybe your delphinium, your foxglove, you want to harvest those when about a third of the flowers are open. So that way, once you put them in the vase, they'll continue to open and will kind of elongate your flowering time once they're harvested. You want to choose the longest stems you can find and strip off the foliage from those stems as soon as you harvest. And that will make the flowers last longer as well, since the leaves won't be transpiring water from the plant. And then if you're out in the field or the garden, place them into some tepid water and floral preservative, you know, the powdery stuff that comes in your bouquets, you can buy that as well. That actually lowers the pH of the water, and that will make the flowers last longer. So it's not a, you know, it's not a gimmick. Those little packets actually do work. A lot of cut flower garden resources from both Rutgers Cooperative Extension and other land-grant universities across the country. So all you have to do is look online. I would add the word extension to any Google search that you're doing on cut flowers to make sure that you're getting information from university experts. So I've listed a couple here that you can check out. There's also some other digital tools. There's this great database from the Cornell University Extension website, which allows you to search for flowers based on their name, their Latin name, their color, and it will give you all sorts of information about those plants, including the site characteristics that they like, what their plant traits are, and any specific planting recommendations. And finally, just some non-academic sources of inspiration. I really enjoy these two books, Florette Farm's Cut Flower Garden and Vegetables Love Flowers. Really nice photos. There's some good recommendations for how to make bouquets and arrangements, and we'll provide a little bit of colorful inspiration for you as you're starting your cut flower garden. So as I mentioned, we are here, we're working from home here at Extension. And so if you've got questions about home gardening, about cut flowers, or anything happening in your home garden, you can email me. I've put my email address here. We have a fleet of master gardeners standing by to answer questions as well. And so please do reach out if you have questions or need advice, and we would be happy to speak to you. So thank you so much for coming to the webinar. And if we have a few minutes, I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Yeah, we have plenty of questions coming in. So if you would like to submit a question, please use the question feature on the GoToWebinar dashboard that's in front of you, and we will get started. All right, first, do you recommend pinching back peonies?
You know, that is something I would have to look at. So there's a couple of different types of peonies. And my first thought is that it probably depends on the type that you have. So there's more of the herbaceous perennial peonies, and then there are the tree peonies, which are more woody, which I think do require some pruning. But in terms of pinching back, I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to look that up. So if you want to send me an email, I'm happy to look into that for you.
Um, does the deadheading process work for pansies?
So does it work? That's an interesting question. So yeah, so the deadheading, again, so there's two reasons to deadhead. One of them is to stop the plant from producing seeds so that it creates more flowers. And the other part is just an aesthetic, that you don't want these dead floral heads on your garden. And so you can deadhead any number of plants depending on your aesthetic sort of preferences in your garden. In terms of, I would assume, yes, that deadheading pansies would, I'm not sure it would increase floral production necessarily, but it would likely stop the plant from going to seed. And so bit of a multi-tiered answer there, but yes, so that process would work for pansies.
All right. Do you have any gopher challenge suggestions?
Ooh, that's a great question. Yeah, gophers are a quite a menace. I think that again there are some repellents that you can buy commercially. I know exclusion is extremely hard because they are very persistent animals. And obviously fencing is not going to do you any good when they're digging underground. Specific I think that beyond trying to outsmart them, trying to exclude them from the burrows that they're making, you could hire a professional to try to relocate the gopher. But no, they are absolutely a menace in many gardens. And so yeah, I would rely probably on repellents and just trying to outsmart the little guys, but knowing that you might be losing some plants to that gopher for a while.
All right. Is yarrow also known as Queen Anne's lace?
No, yarrow is a different flower. It does look a little bit like Queen Anne's lace, and Queen Anne's lace is would be another lovely filler plant to include in your cut flower garden. But they are different. Their flowers look a little bit different. The yarrow is a little bit more compact. The flowers are a little bit more compact in the floral sort of head. Whereas Queen Anne's lace is a little bit more airy and has a slightly different shape. So I would actually recommend both for the cut flower garden. They're both beautiful plants. You can often find Queen Anne's lace, just in native environments here in New Jersey. It's a gorgeous flower to have. Really nice for pollinators as well.
All right. What is a natural, easily obtained floral preservative?
So I'm not going to get into any sort of, so natural. Natural, I'm not sure what natural means necessarily. There are many that are commercially available. Again, the purpose of the floral preservative is to lower the pH, so to acidify the water. And so this will kill, it has antibacterial properties, so it will kill bacteria in the water and make the flowers last longer. In terms of a natural product, I don't know of any sort of natural product that you'd come across that goes beyond the commercially available ones. So I would check out your local gardening center. You can certainly purchase floral preservative online as well.
I'm thinking of getting a mason beehive. Can you mention some plants they'd like best?
Oh, well, so I'm not a bee expert, but I have given talks about increasing habitat and forage for pollinators in general. And so many, again, I can't speak specifically to mason bees. I know that we've got some master gardeners who love to answer that question for you. In general, for pollinators, though, planting things with many small flowers, so things like those composite flowers like echinacea, rudbeckia, black-eyed Susan, sunflowers, as well as things in the mint family, which also have many smaller blossoms. And so mint and lemon balm, lots of your flowering herbs, lavender, those things are wonderful to add if you'd like to increase pollinator activity on your property.
All right, we have a little bit of explanation about the natural um, preservations, like household products for like baking soda, Epsom salts, etc. I think is what they were referring to.
Okay, yeah, I do not, I'm not sure about that. Then I'd have to do some research and get back to you.
All right. Is it important to recut flowers underwater before putting in a vase?
Yes, and so yes, so that's a nice way to keep flowers fresher for longer. So again, you want to make your initial cut with a clean sharp tool when you're out in the garden. As quickly as you can, place that into some tepid water. Um, and you know, in the farming world, we have this term called field heat, and that's the kind of amount of residual heat on the product when you take it from the field. And so basically, you want to cool the flowers down if you're working on a hot day as quickly as possible. Let them hydrate in that water for a little bit of time before you put them in some sort of arrangement, so they can draw up some water from that bucket or container. And then, yeah, every couple of days, trimming off the ends of those stems will sort of rejuvenate the flowers and allow, sort of encourage the flowers to take up water, keeping the plant hydrated and keeping it flowering for a longer period of time. So yes, that is a practice I would recommend.
Can you please talk about any tips for cut flower gardening in containers?
Sure, yeah, so I actually had some slides in here that I ended up taking out because it was getting too long, about cut flower gardening in either raised beds or pots or containers. This is great for spaces that maybe you don't have a whole backyard where you can choose a nice space for a bed, or you have soil that is of such poor quality that you don't want to bother amending it. And so the container itself, it has to be something that can drain. And so for any sort of container gardening, you want to make sure that your container either has something, drainage holes, or that you can put drainage holes in it. In terms of the medium that you're using, typically soil right from the garden is going to be too heavy and dense for containers. And so they're not going to drain quite as well. So I would recommend either a potting mix if it's a small container, or you can mix compost, finished compost with peat moss, sometimes some coarse sand mixed with topsoil. That can create a really nice sort of light soilless or soil medium for growing in a container. One issue with container gardening is that, especially if you're using pots, not quite so much with raised beds, but for pots, they tend to dry out faster than if you're planting right into the ground. And so I would keep an eye on that. So make sure that you're checking the soil to make sure that it's moist fairly regularly, and flowering or watering as often as those plants need it. But no, you can absolutely grow. The other sort of piece of advice is just to group plants together that have similar needs in a container. So that sounds pretty obvious to do, but if one plant, really likes full sun and the other one kind of gets pretty wimpy in full sun or heat, you don't want to group those flowers together in a single container. So you have to think ahead of time a little bit about what plants you're actually growing together.
We have a question. Will the slides be available? This is being recorded, so everybody who registered, I will email you a link to the recording once it is up and ready. And I think, Margaret, we talked about also making the slides available as a download too.
Yes, I can absolutely do that. And so all of the links that I included and my contact information will be part of those slides. And so I can send those to you, Andrew, after the presentation, so you can distribute those as well.
Great. Groundhog resistant varieties as well as repelling techniques.
Yeah, so again, this is definitely a major pest of both flower and vegetable gardens. I don't have any repellent like brands for you at this point. And in terms of planting unpalatable species, I would have to do some more research on that. Most of the questions that we get are about deer, and so that's why I include that slide about deer. And we know a lot about what species they like and which they don't. Groundhogs, I think, can be a little bit trickier in that regard. So again, in terms of now that we've got a couple of these questions, I will do some research on that, and we'll try to make that information available about groundhog either exclusion or deterrence in the cut flower garden. Great question.
Should you pinch back throughout the season?
That's a good question. I think that it sort of depends on the flower that you're growing. So again, those plants that tend to get produce multiple stems and grow sort of in a vertical habit. So zinnias come to mind, and dahlias. There are certain plants that you don't want, that don't benefit from pinching back. So you pinch back in the start of the season, and then as you're harvesting, these stems, that is kind of a version of pinching back. So at that point, hopefully you have encouraged that plant to get wide and bushy and produce lots of these stems. The act of harvesting flowers is kind of a form of pinching back as well. So the more flowers you harvest of specific species, again, I keep going back to this like garden workhorse of the zinnia, but the more flowers you harvest over the season, that will also indicate to the plant to produce more floral stems. So in a way, that is a type of pinching back. So again, it's all about sort of sending these signals to the plant. And if you want it to flower for longer and be bushier and put out more floral stems, then yes, continue to harvest those stems.
What fragrant flowers do you recommend to grow in the garden?
Yeah, so there are quite a few. The first that comes to mind is definitely peony. Some daffodils will have a really lovely scent. I had a slide in here before about incorporating, which again I took out because I was getting too long, but about incorporating flowering herbs into the flower garden. And so many of our favorite culinary herbs actually have very beautiful foliage. I'm thinking and produce these small but lovely flowers. And so things like lemon balm, oregano, that kind of has a draping sort of habit. Lavender, of course, is beautiful. Basil, there are specific cutting varieties of basil that will go to flower and look very beautiful and be very fragrant. But yeah, certainly that is. I didn't really talk about how to choose varieties from a seed catalog because we're kind of past the seed ordering stage at this point. But reading those descriptions is another great way to learn about these different varieties of plants based on different characteristics like fragrance and color. And often these seed catalogs will have a specific section dedicated to cut flowers. Sometimes you'll see a little icon of some scissors next to the description, and that indicates it's a good cut flower. And so reading up on those and gardening blogs of people's favorite fragrant flowers is a nice way to choose those as well.
How hardy are larkspur delphinium, and do they require much?
Yeah, so these would fall into that biennial category. You know, it's a little bit tough. We're in sort of a I would say it probably depends on the winter that we've had. And so a winter like this one, yes, I would say that they could potentially put out some vegetative growth in the fall and then overwinter and produce the following spring. Um, I would say they're probably less hardy during a very severe winter, unlike some other perennials in the flower garden. In terms of whether they require much, I think when you're taking care of, I assume that you mean fertility wise and maintenance wise. So I think delphinium is a tough plant to grow. I recently read that they prefer alkaline soils. So whereas most of our cut flowers and many perennials like a slightly acidic soil, I think delphinium sometimes needs a higher pH, and so they can be difficult to grow for that reason. Um, and in terms of fertility, most of the plants that we grow as biennials or perennials can benefit from top dressing with compost, usually in the springtime. When a plant is flowering, that's a nice, or putting on a lot of growth, that's a nice time to fertilize because the plant is putting its resources towards producing flowers. And so, yeah, delphinium I would say is tricky, but I think yeah. For all of these, it pays to get to know the individual species and what to expect in our region. This is another great question for some of our master gardeners who have been growing in this region for a very long time.
Another question about delphiniums is, do they require much space?
Yeah, they get rather tall. This is another, piece of information that's usually when you're setting out to either buy perennial plants or biennial plants from starts or seedlings. Usually that information will come with that plant. But yeah, they do get a little bit bushy and they do get rather tall. Often delphinium will need some sort of staking as well because they put up those sort of tall flower spikes and are sort of prone to tipping over when it gets windy.
Right. Any tips for dealing with aphids?
Aphids, yeah. So we didn't talk too much about pest control, and so a good place to start is just again removing all of the external factors that could weaken your plant. So making sure that they're getting enough sunlight and water and fertility. Aphids are kind of if you've been gardening for any amount of time, you're going to encounter them in the garden. There's not a lot of uh, cut flower specific sort of recommendations for pest management. And I think especially for home gardeners, if you're a commercial producer and you are and your goal is to have this the aesthetic look of your flowers, of your product is really the way that you're making your living, then I would be much more concerned about insect damage. For the home cut flower grower, it tends not to be as big of an issue. But for aphids in particular, again, I would personally probably stick to organic pest control methods just because same as a vegetable garden, this is again personally, but you are bringing, unlike other flowers on your property that might be in an ornamental bed, you are actually bringing part of the plant inside with you and maybe placing them on your kitchen table. And so I feel more comfortable using some of the more organic methods. So aphids, yeah, the insecticidal soaps, horticultural oils will sometimes will help with those soft-bodied insects. Washing them off, some people will just use soap, soap and water, or wash them, rinse them with a hose. And then making sure that you're growing a variety of plants in your garden to encourage beneficial insects. So things like lady beetles and some other insects really love to prey on aphids. And so making sure that you're encouraging a diversity of other insects in your garden as well.
Is there anything rabbits don't like?
Lots of animal questions, and again, I apologize. I'm not so much of a wildlife expert. You know, if they're if it might be a similar scenario as deer, where there's nothing completely deer resistant, and there might not be anything that is completely rabbit resistant. It's just a matter of how hungry the animal is, and what the availability of other food sources is. And so I don't have particular experience with rabbits. I could certainly do research for you, but it might be a you know, an experiment of trying to find, you know, generally animals don't like plants that are, again, spiky or fuzzy or give off a particular scent or an odor. And so you might try, you know, species that have a fuzzy stem, or maybe some sort of unpalatable sort of texture or scent. But for rabbits, yeah, I would have to do some research about what exactly plants are that rabbits will not demolish in your garden.
All right, well, it looks like that is all the questions that we have. So again, I'd like to thank you, Margaret, for a wonderful presentation.
All right, thank you. And thank you everybody for tuning in. Good luck out there, and please do reach out if you've got some more gardening questions.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.